Welcome back to the Beginner's Guide. Welcome to a really cool video. Because so far in this series, we worked in HTML. So we added content to our website right here. And although adding content is fun, I think what's also fun is adding style to your website. And we will do that in this and in the next videos of the series by using CSS, cascading style sheets. Now in this video, we will have a first look at the theory and apply some first styling steps to our website. And well, I cannot wait to start that together with you right now. So before we go back to our code, let's first have a look at this question. Why CSS? Why cascading style sheets? Well, you kind of know the answer already, but I think it makes sense to dive a little bit into the theory before we go back to the code. Now, we use CSS for the following reason basically. Because at the moment we have HTML, and because of that, our page looks something like this. Now we have all the content in it, which is totally fine, but style, I'm not sure. I don't think this looks really good. So how can we now change this into that? So into a page with, as I would say, a little bit more style in it. Well, the answer is, of course, we need HTML plus CSS. Now the question is, how can we achieve that? How can we use CSS to style this page? And the answer is, well, if we think back about our HTML code and all these different elements, well, this might be the key to achieve that. Because if we look at Mike's World, for example, right here, we can of course find Mike's World also in our stylized or into our web page with the applied CSS right here. So there is kind of a connection apparently. And this connection, by the connection I mean the way CSS interacts with HTML, can be achieved via the elements. In this case, this could be the header element, or inside the header element, we have the h1 element. If we go back to our code, you remember we have the header element right there, and inside we have the h1 element, Mike's World. So if we would be able to kind of access or select these elements, well, then this could be kind of a way to define that the header, for example, should have this purple background and that the font color should be white for Mike's World. That's one example. But let's have a look at another one, because right here, this part of our website, we also have different elements. And we can also find this part again in our website with the applied CSS. Now, which elements do we have right here? Well, these elements could be first the main element, because this defines the element which includes all the content in here. And the content that we have in this main element is basically an unordered list. Now, let's have a look at the code again. And right here, we have the main element right there. Here we have the unordered list. We also have the list right here and the paragraph, but we'll talk about that later. The important thing now is, if we go back to the slide, that we should be able to access or again select the different elements to be able to apply specific styles to them. Now, because of that, it probably makes sense to have a look at the syntax of CSS. But before we do that, let's think about one question. Why is it actually called cascading style sheets? Well, the answer is again quite simple actually. Cascading simply means that if you think about the CSS code from top to bottom, that the latest code or the latest styling defined is applied. And what do I mean by that? Let's say you define the styling of an h1 element right here. Let's say you say the font color should be white, like in that case. So you write this code on top of your CSS code. Then at the bottom, at the last code line of your CSS code, you again specify a styling for an h1 element. This time you define that the font color should be yellow. Therefore, the font color won't be white anymore because of the cascading structure of CSS. The last definition of that element will be applied, and by that, the font color would be yellow. Now, of course, there are more things or some more things that we have to think about, but for the moment, let's not make things too complicated. Let's keep it like that, and let's now think about the syntax before we go back to our code. Because the CSS syntax basically looks, well, like this. Well, now you say, okay, I have 3 words there, I have some curly braces, a colon and a semicolon. What should I do with that? Well, let's have a look at this step by step. Because the combination of what you can see right here is the CSS code, and this is basically a rule, so a CSS rule. Okay, now what are the components or the different parts of this rule? Well, the first part is this header right here. And if you remember, we just saw this header, or we know this header actually, as an element of our HTML code. And that's the interesting thing. With CSS, we can simply select, and therefore it's called a selector, the different elements of our HTML code. Now, CSS or the selectors are not limited to the elements only, but we'll talk about other items you can select in your code later throughout the series. For the moment, let's just assume that with the selector, we can select the different elements of our HTML code. Now we need the curly braces, as you can see it right here. And after the curly braces, we start a new line. And then we see the next word. In this case, this is color. Now what's that now? Well, the color is simply the property. And the property in CSS basically defines what do you want to change. In this case, we want to change the color, the property, of our header element. So we selected the header element of our HTML code. That's the second thing, property. After the property, we need another thing, this red right here. Now what's the red? Well, you have a property, but you need to define a value for the property because you want to change the color. I understood that, but to which color? And that's the reason why we need that value right here. And the combination of the property and the value, so this part right here, is simply called the declaration. Important, as you can see it right here. Make sure to add the colon right here after the property, and also don't forget to add the semicolon after the value. And in the end, in the third line right here, you can see that you have to close the curly braces, of course. But this is it actually. This is the basic syntax and the basic idea how CSS works. And I think with that theoretical background, we can now go back to our code and have a look at CSS from a more practical perspective actually. So let's go back. So I am back on our web page or in the code of our web page, and if we look at it again, well, we can see that it looks like this. Now let's maybe focus onto this Mike's World part right here. We know that this is the header. Let's maybe also open the Chrome Developer Tools like that, and by that navigate to the header right here. So this is the part we want to focus on to right now. Now back to the code, and well, now we know how CSS code generally works or what it looks like, but where should we add it in our index.html file? Well, the thing is, we have 2 options how we can add CSS code to our index.html file, or better said, to our project in general. Let's have a look at the first, or one approach first, and this approach simply means adding your entire CSS code to the index.html file. This leads us to the question, where should we add that? Well, if you think back about the logic of our HTML file, then you know that in the body element, we only want to have the content of the page. But as CSS is not really a content, it's totally optional because it only adds styling to it, but the page would work totally fine without any CSS. Well, therefore, it definitely has to go to the head element and not to the body element, which would mean that it is a real content of the page. So we should add CSS right here. Now let's do this. And well, what do we need now? We need style. So if we type style right here, we can see that Visual Studio Code already shows it to us. So by pressing tab and maybe adding some lines right here, we can start writing our first CSS code. Now, how do we start? Remember, the first thing we need is a selector. And the selector should be the header now. We just talked about that. Like that. So we got the header. What do we then need? We need the curly braces. And now let's type enter to start a second line. And what do we need then? Do you remember? we need the property. So basically, what do we want to change? In this case, we want to change the color. Like that. As you can see, you have lots of different properties available in CSS, but we will talk about that later. Let's now focus on the color and press tab. As you can see, the colon was added automatically. And now we need a value for that color, and this value could be red, like we had it in our example. Don't forget to add the semicolon now, like that. Now, if we save that and go back to our website, let's reload it. Well, then you can see up here that Mike's World, or the font color of Mike's World, now turned into red. And this simply happened because we defined that CSS code right here. Now, can we add more properties? Of course we can. Let's simply add a new line or go to a new line and now say background. As you can see, you have lots of different options available again. So we will select background color like that. And now we will specify a color, but now we will use hex code because that's also possible in CSS. So we simply type hash. And now let's use 521751 and add a semicolon. Let's maybe also change the color up here and simply type white, for example, like that. Now we got that. Let's save that again. Let's go back to our site and reload it. And as you can see, now we defined the background color of Mike's World and the font color of Mike's World. That was actually quite easy. And you might also wonder, well, how should I know which properties are available? How should I navigate through that jungle of CSS? Well, the answer is, first, it's not that difficult because you will learn it step by step, also in this video series, of course. And additionally, we again have the MDN, the Mozilla Developer Network. And in the MDN, you can find the CSS reference right here. A link to the CSS reference is of course also attached down there in the video description. But if you have a look at that and scroll down, well, then you can see all the different properties available in CSS. Well, and now you might say, whoa, how should I deal with that? That's a lot. Well, as I just said, no worries, you won't need all of them, of course. You will dive into that step by step and basically use some of the main properties most of the time. For example, we used the color property, and you can find the color property right there. Now, we will not dive into all of these properties now, of course, throughout the series, but into some of them. In this video, I only want to show you one more property. And this property is this one here, the font size right there. Now let's go back to our page right here and maybe change the font size now of Mike's World. So let's go back to our code and let's not change it by working in the header, but let's now add another selector, the H1 selector, open the curly braces and now specify font size. And let's say this should be 20 pixels. I will talk about the different options you have right here because we don't have only pixels, of course, regarding the size in the next videos. For now, let's just keep it with the pixels. So if we save that and go back and reload the page, we can see that the font size changed. That makes sense, right? Because you remember, if we go back to the header right here, we can see that inside the header right there, we have the H1 element. And we applied this font size now to the H1 element. Now, let's go back and let's think about another thing. Because what happens now if I change the color right here, let's say to yellow, like that? What do you think is going to happen now? Because actually, we defined the color up here in the header. So if we go back now, reload, now the font color changed to yellow. And you remember that cascading approach I just talked about because we first specified the color in the header. But after that, we have the H1 element, and inside this element, we now specify that the font color should be yellow. Now, that's not the only important thing right here. Additionally, we know that H1 right there is nested inside this header element. This also has an impact onto the way the styling is applied to the different elements. But this is something we will dive deeper into in the next video. For the moment, just keep in mind that the definition up here for the header element can be overwritten by this h1 element, by this h1 selector in that case. And because of that, we can also say that we delete that color up here, because we basically don't need it, and maybe change the font color right there back to white. Now, if we go back and reload it, we can see that Mike's world is white again. Now, talking about specific elements, there is one last thing that I would like to change in this basics video. Because if we jump back to our page once again, you can see that this contact right there, this link, has this underscore right there. And I don't like that, to be honest. I would like to remove that. To do that, we go back to our code, add another selector. This time I will add A for anchor, because, do you know why? Because the anchor, and let me create the curly braces first, like that, because the anchor is right here the element that we have inside our list. And the anchor has a specific style automatically applied. And this style is, for example, that blue color and an underscore. This means if I now refer to the anchor with my selector, and now say text minus decoration, and set it equal with a value of none, save that, now reload that, you can see that the underscore disappeared. And as you just learned, if we now go back, right here, define the color and make it black maybe, like this, then we can also see that our contact link now is black. So this is actually what I wanted to show you regarding the basics of CSS. We will dive into a lot more detail in the next videos of this series because, as you can see, apparently we can refer to different elements, we can also refer to nested elements, and this all impacts the way our style or our CSS code is applied. Now, for this video, that's all the code I would like to apply, but there is one thing that you can already see, because writing the code this way has two issues actually. The first issue is that, well, if you apply CSS for more elements right here, well, this kind of gets messy because we have all that CSS code up here and you have to scroll down to the HTML. Well, not really comfortable at all. Another problem is the following. If I go back to the page right here, maybe close to developer tools now, and then go to contact to open our second page, no styling is applied at all. Because how should it be? We added all our CSS code right here in the main index HTML file. Therefore, our contact HTML file right here has no styling applied at all. So what we should do is we should actually copy that code, paste it into the index HTML file right here, and then it would be applied. But imagine that wouldn't make any sense because every time you change something in your styling that should be applied to both pages, you have to rechange your code again and again. So this doesn't make any sense. And of course, there is a better solution for that. And this is the second approach, how we can add CSS to our project that I talked about some minutes ago. Because the second approach simply means that we create a separate CSS file. How can we do this? Well, as always, we go to the Explorer right here, click right here to create a new file, maybe not in the contact folder, sorry for that, so I just press escape. Let's click right here and now create the file right there in the main folder and call it style.css. Just as you prefer, the important thing is that CSS ending right here. Now what we can do is we can go to index.html and delete the style element right here and right there. Now copy all that code, or not copy, cut it actually, and paste it right here into our style CSS file, like that. Now back to index.html, we can get rid of these empty lines. And with that, if we save this, and if we save that, we can see the dot disappeared. And if we go back to our page, to home, we can see that our style is gone. Now, why is this happening? Well, because how should the index.html file now know that it should use that style? Because there is no reference at all. If you look at our code, we have that style CSS file, but well, how should index.html know that it should apply the style to different elements in there? And because of that, we have to add another information to our HTML file to make sure that the style is applied correctly. And where do we add that information? Well, again, we add it in the head, of course. And what do we do right here? Well, we simply need to create a link to our style CSS file. And I already said it actually. We simply have to write link right here, press tab. Now, style sheet is totally correct. And the hyperreference is simply style.css. Like that. Let's save that. And don't forget to copy that. And also add it right here in the second index.html file. So in our contact HTML file basically, because otherwise the second page, so the contact page, would be without any style, and this is something that we don't like. However, another thing, we learned that in the last video, we work with relative paths right here, therefore we have to add .. to navigate back up to the main folder right there, and therefore being able to access the style.css file. Now, if we also save that right here, and go back to our page and reload it, we can see that Mike's world is now, well, formatted correctly with the correct colors. And if we go to contact, we can see that the same style is applied right there. And with that, we actually understood the basics of CSS, and we saw how we can use CSS on our website. Now, of course, we will dive deeper in the next videos into CSS and show what else we can do. And one really important concept, therefore, will be covered in the next video when we will talk about boxes. Boxes in CSS are a really important concept that you definitely have to understand to become a real CSS expert. So I hope to see you in the next video. And as always, the only thing I can say right now is thanks a lot for watching. Bye.